Around 10 o'clock at night a few days earlier, someone knocked on my door. I think I should explain how the young girl operates. Something is invited to enter when a door or window is opened. Opening the door to a legitimate guest invites them, and them alone, into the residence. This cannot be the young girl's request to come in. When I have late-night guests, she usually hides on the opposite side of the house and runs, at least human ones. An invitation is sent when a window or door is opened. The invitation is open to anyone who might like to respond if no one accepts. When opening the door after dark, exercise caution. You have no idea what you might allow in. However, I believe that windows are less dangerous for you. When it comes to what constitutes an invitation, the little girl is just particularly combative. I opened the door with no cause for alarm, even though the little girl was already in the yard, sobbing at my windows. Opening the door was an invitation for them and them alone, even if I didn't let them in. Even though I logically understand all of this, I must admit that when I opened the door and saw that no one was there, my heart nevertheless missed a beat. I walked over to where Midge's huge quiver lay frozen in the corner and reached out to pull the politely stacked book. With only the motion sensor floodlight above the garage for illumination, I gazed out into the pitch-black yard. The gate swayed gently as it swung open. I couldn't see the person who had knocked in the field that went down to the woods, but it was obvious that they had just run away via the front. Well, nothing human. That distance was too much for anyone to cover in such a short period of time. But for now, I was more concerned about where they had gone than about the little girl standing at the fence. Tears marred her cheeks as she stood at the doorway, watching me. I hurried to the steps behind her, carefully opening the wicker cage, which had been the trapdoor since the night before. The young lady has been targeted for destruction by earlier generations. They were all unsuccessful. As I look at her and go back to what I discovered in the hallway, my ants strewn about remains, I believe I can see why we keep trying. It was unexpected and blindingly hateful. I felt as though it would burn me to ash if I didn't let go of the heat that invaded my muscles. I wanted her to try using the open door as an invitation for a little while. I would use my bare hands to kill her. Then she raised an arm, half-turned, and gestured toward the trees. It was an obvious message. That's where my visitor had gone. They were anticipating my arrival. Leaving the door ajar behind me, I growled and returned to my home. Did my mother leave that window open because she felt this way? Was it an accident? Or did she share my rage? Did she wait for the little girl with her own knife in her hands on their bed as my father slept? I'm not sure. I won't. I went to the bedroom and got my flashlight, shotgun, and knife. The girl had not taken it as an invitation, and she was still waiting outside when I went back to the front door. I closed the door behind me and went outside. She was being challenged to take action by this as well. To justify myself, this was the first time I had done it. I couldn't tell if this was safe or not. In the past, I would typically exit through the garage if a guest invited me outside. I only remember going out through the front once, on Halloween, with the man wearing the skull cup. I thought he was protecting me from the young girl. This time, however, I went straight past her, down the front stairs, and through the yard. I believe, had the little girl seized the chance, I would have wasted my aunt's gift of sacrifice. This is simple to comprehend after the event. However, have you ever experienced hatred that pierces deeply and eats away at your bones? It demands destruction, regardless of whether you are the object of that devastation. The rage has us as slaves. You will understand why I took the risks I did if you have experienced this previously. However, since I was pursuing my visitor and she had no claim to me, I assumed the transactional nature of opening the door remained, and the young girl let me to pass unhurt. As I crossed the field to the forest, my rage subsided. The flavor of the night air calmed it down, and by the time they were halfway across the field, the rage had vanished and only adrenaline remained. With my hands shaking and a slight shiver, I understood that I had just walked very near to the edge of my own grave. Death's road has crossed mine. I had been quite fortunate. Although I wish I could say that this won't happen again, I believe we've all noticed that I tend to do this. Breaking a habit is not the same as this. Part of who I am is anger. I arrived at the wood's edge. I was unsure of who I was pursuing, so I hesitated here. Is the woman with the extra eyes attempting to entice me to leave the house? I would like to argue that she wouldn't try such a blatant ruse because I wasn't foolish enough to fall for it. But I suppose I am that foolish, because I was standing there at the edge of the woods. Of course, there were some other options. It looked just like the dancers would do this. Another suspect was the fairy. They could not want to speak at my house or in the field, because I don't believe I've seen them anywhere but the forest. I continued. I badly needed an ally, with the man with the skull cup out of commission, but the chances were slim, because it was a bad year and everyone was out to kill me. That's a risk I would accept. In addition, I was ready for a battle and had a gun and knife if it wasn't someone I knew well. Admittedly, I kind of hoped it was the woman with the additional eyes. This time, should I refer to the man with the skull cup as Alistair? On the list, it is the second name. Should I go straight to Camillo instead? Goff hasn't woken up yet, and he seems to be quite popular. At least he doesn't appear to be getting worse. It took some time for him to notice that I had filled his cup improperly, but he looked sickly. However, given that the cup was broken, I'm not sure how long this will take. The sooner I kill her, the better, I reason. Most likely whatever was out here would find me before I did. That's the way these things operate. I simply had to keep going till they bothered to show up. I went into the woods without turning on my flashlight. The upper woods have enough moonlight that it's best to turn off the light once your eyesight has adjusted. I try not to use the light unless I'm looking for something specific and need to see details because it narrows your field of view. Naturally, it's easier to miss things when you can only see broad forms. Similar, like ice on the ground. Rule 19, although nighttime temperatures can drop, frost shouldn't form inside your tent. Call the camp emergency hotline if the cold wakes you up and you notice frost. Remain composed and inside your tent. We'll come grab you. When I exhaled in a cloud, I became aware. Turning on my flashlight and directing the beam at my feet, I halted and struggled for it. As I watched, the tips of the leaves curled and cracked as they fused together, and the ground was silvered with frost that solidified into ice. I was directly approaching it. The simplest answer was to turn around and leave, which I did. However, the ice kept spreading, so I turned around and started to walk from a different direction. Since the cold spreads from a central point, maybe I had been traveling parallel to the frost, and this would place me at a perpendicular and perhaps move me away from the origin. This also didn't work. My fingertips were becoming numb and my knuckles were stinging as the cold began to permeate into my skin. The bark of the trees gleamed with creeping frost and branches snapped beneath the feet. I understood that unless my sense of direction was badly impaired, which it shouldn't be since I usually have a decent feel of it, I should have figured out a way out of it by now. Therefore, I needed to choose a direction, stick with it, and move rapidly. One terrifying prospect remained. It was after me. It was also catching up. This is not the appropriate behavior for guests. I accelerated my speed and called into the surrounding darkness. You don't entice someone to risk their life. After all, I doubt the lights have figured out how to knock on doors. It might not have been a guest, though. After all, a visitor was expected to arrive at the residence. I didn't care anymore, and I had forgotten what I was after. I needed to leave that place. A cracking sound came from behind me, like clay disintegrating and breaking in two. With my heart racing, I looked back over my shoulder. Like ice breaking apart in the water, the ground behind me was collapsing inwards, crashing into thick fissures and fracturing into frozen shards. Their fingers seized the dirt, causing it to break under their claws and fall into the darkness they were trying to escape. I paused. I don't really know why. One of the hands reached out through the icy ground, and I fixed my eyes on it. It was as though the entire world had been swept away from me, leaving me adrift with only the sight of that arm with its fingers spread wide, pointing in my direction. I believe, for a while I forgot who I was. I believed I had heard my name. From inside the abyss I heard someone calling. I assumed it was my aunt's hand extending toward me. As I staggered forward and held out my hand to her, the ground lurched beneath me. I dropped on one knee, putting a hand on the ground to balance myself as the ice shattered and the dirt sheet I was standing on sank. When I lifted it again, it burned painfully, and the quickly formed ice left my skin behind, leaving my palm moist with blood. I hardly noticed the agony. I knelt down and crawled forward, focusing on the hand that was reaching for me. Some of you have heard me say that on my property, the dead don't answer. There is just silence when we call to them. Maybe this was the reason, I thought. It's possible that my aunt was waiting for me to rescue her and drag her free from that abyss. Just like hatred, grief can push someone to self-destruction. The waiting hand was nearly at my fingertips. Now, a sea of outstretched limbs was developing, all of them eager to welcome me. My dad? Mommy? The frostbitten flesh gleamed in the moonlight. Their fingertips glittered with ice. My eyes froze on my cheeks as I sobbed freely. So near. She would be with me, and everything would be fine again, if I could just get a touch of her. I was hoisted forcefully up and away by an arm that hooked around my waist. I yelled and extended my hands, gazing in horror as the earth shattered like glass and poured inward over them, as those fingers drew away from me. "Auntie!" Clawing at the guy who pulled me back, I yelled, "Auntie!" My captor had no regrets. I pushed against the arm around my waist and the other across the bottom of my ribcage, but it kept pulling me away, even as I pressed my feet into the ground. I was swiftly swept away by a completely unnatural strength, and they were like an iron prison that I could not move. As the frost melted and disappeared back into the ground, I watched helplessly as it took all of those clutching hands with it. It kept pulling me along until it was completely out of sight and the cold had completely gone, at which point it dropped me to the forest floor. With a bone-aching exhaustion, I collapsed, the fight leaking out of me. I sat on my knees and gazed at the floor numbly. When the cold finally set in and I became conscious of the frost on the backs of my arms, my entire body started to tremble. My icy cheeks ached from the tears. It seemed as if an inextricable weight had been lifted from my mind, and I could experience my body the way it really was. The speaker murmured softly, "Kate, you buried her in the family cemetery. She's not present. Not one of them is." Margaret grimaced at the words but did not speak. She was too tired. Zach fell silent. He, by this point, was piling the dishes in the sink. I shivered and replied, I saw her. You got what you were hoping for. You can't get them back after they're gone." Never in my life have I felt so isolated. Behind me, it hummed uncontrollably. The robes wrapped around my back. I believed he knelt. With both hands on either shoulder, he wrapped one arm around my back. I recognized that I knew this being. I had already encountered it. He inquired, "Do you recall what I told you as a child?" So few people have the ability to choose how they die, but knowing that doesn't make things any simpler. Making their dying less painful isn't the goal. It's about respecting their decisions and not wanting to change them. Was it impolite to reject the sanctity of her decision and demand her return? "You were the one who came to knock on my door?" I inquired. "So what made you take me through the forest?" "I have explanations." He stood up, releasing my shoulders. "Hold on. Who are you?" I turned to look up at him and inquired. However, nothing was present. I stood where I was, looking into the darkness, as though I may see this thing there, Rather, I heard my name being called. My brother was the one. I stumbled to my feet, swore, and began to blunder noisily in his direction. Believe me, you want the other person to hear you approaching when there's a good chance they're armed. Luckily, I didn't have to travel very far. I was shocked that I hadn't heard him approach earlier because he was so close. "What on earth are you doing outside?" When we finally located one another in the wood's darkness, I made a demand. He did have his shotgun with him. I had good reason to be cautious. "Searching for you," he answered. After he called my cell and I didn't answer, he called the landline and became concerned that I had done something stupid. For example, pursue the woman with the additional eyes without any strategy. That's not what I was out here doing, was it? Of course not, new. I wouldn't act in such a stupid manner. Look, both you and I are aware that I am, but he doesn't need another concern. I then questioned why he was attempting to locate me at such a late hour. He took out his phone and opened a picture. He summarized since I couldn't understand the handwriting on that tiny photo of an ancient letter. He had been going over the one post that discussed killing the lady's predecessor when he came across a detail that he had initially overlooked. Although it was poorly worded, he had mistakenly credited it. What if it wasn't, though? What if the author had meant this precisely? The paper had been written as an allegation of discrimination against women. Damn it all, I would like to hear how a cop's gang cave it. According to the entry, in order to locate the witch, they had brought a torch from the dark into the woods. According to my brother, they intended to write a torch for the dark. But what if the dark was their way of characterizing one of the critters on this campground without giving it a name? He asked, his voice becoming more agitated with each word. This may have been their version of trying to avoid identifying things, but it was much worse, because they weren't as paranoid as I am. I haven't informed him of your efforts to come up with a moniker for the man wearing the skull cup. He doesn't have to be aware of that. Everything is all right. Furthermore, perhaps he will simply end up as Sippy Cup Bay and be too embarrassed to reveal his identity ever again. Or perhaps people won't agree on a name collectively, and I won't have to worry about any potential repercussions. In any case, Kate will have to deal with that issue in the future. That didn't seem serious enough to warrant a late-night phone call and a subsequent trek out to find me. After some hesitation, he stated that he was concerned about more than simply the fact that I hadn't picked up the phone. Our uncle's passing had been quite painful. He had volunteered extensively at the campground, and while family is still present, things had changed. For those who were willing to become heavily involved in the activities at the campsite, losing our aunt meant the end of the road. I can still rely on my family for support, but it won't be the same. They are cautious. They have families and lives, so they have good incentive to stay hidden and wait out the difficult year. Now it was just me. And him, he said. He and I. I inquired about his spouse. He said dismissively, if she divorced him, then so be it. But he turned his head aside so I couldn't see his face. He ought to have realized that he couldn't lead a typical life. The resentment in his voice was not lost on me. He then inquired as to why I was outside, and I explained that something had knocked on my door. Something occurred to me halfway through my explanation, and I started to ramble. I was lured into the woods by my visitor for a reason. I slowly turned around and illuminated the object I had been kneeling in front of with the flashlight. What I had been brought to by the thing. Because I was upset and crying and couldn't see well through my tears, I hadn't processed anything at first. However, I could now see that a pile of dead leaves and broken branches stood in front of me. A torch from the dark. I must take a branch from the object in the dark in order to locate the woman with the extra eyes. I work as a campsite manager, and since I can't think of anything else to do but grab a pair of running shoes and start sprinting as a new pastime, I suppose it's time. And sure, I've already tried politely inquiring and making an offer, but it didn't answer. I suppose I'm snatching fire from the sky and prometheating this stuff. I've lost too many individuals, yet I'm aware that the story doesn't end well. Too many sacrifices and too many deaths. I'm tired of witnessing the people around me go through all of this. And if my brother wants to participate right now, well, it seems like yesterday to me. The towel from the flour sack stretched tightly over the hoop in my hands as I sat in the living room. The printed letters A, B, and C had been sewn through by me. I had to undo at least 14 stitches after I had pricked my finger 7 times. I detested embroidery. We've been through this before, Sybil. It's customary in the Wayne family. Since I can remember, all of the women in our family have mastered this ability. It's your and Olivia's turn now. I frowned down at my uneven stitches and jagged lettering. Why is Jacob exempt from doing it? She sighed in frustration. Because that's the way things are. All right, you can spend the rest of the day outside after completing 2 more letters. That made me tense, so I went back to my task, piercing the fabric a bit harder than I should have. I completed D&E with crooked, sloppy stitches in about 5 minutes. I showed my sampler to Mother. She sighed and held it. Back then, I used to make her sigh a lot. Oh, Sybil, I hope you'll give this some serious thought. Why aren't you more like Olivia, your sister? With her posture flawless and nary a hair out of place, Olivia sat on the other end of the couch. Even though she had just sewn A and B, they were flawless, with each stitch precisely aligned. I couldn't help but notice the distance between us during those moments. Even though she was just a year older than me, she seemed so much more successful, so ladylike, so poised. She was the child my mom had always desired. I was obviously deficient in that area. Stitching was not my thing. I liked torn knees and climbing trees. Olivia's room was filled with porcelain dolls that she kept in a careful arrangement. Under my bed, in a handmade box filled with dirt, was my own collection of worms. It was clear who was the favored. Naturally, I found it bothersome. Any child finds it difficult to understand that they are given far less preference than their sibling. However, I wasn't prepared to sacrifice my happiness in order to be the ideal daughter my mother desired. In order to find my elder brother Jacob and ask him whether he would mind playing catch with me, I dropped my embroidery and hurried out the front door. Olivia never even glanced up from her task, as if she was only interested in that single line of thread. My stitching skills never improved. I only ever learned how to do the most basic running stitch since I was too stubborn to follow my mother's directions. Of course, Olivia was an expert at it. French knot, woven wheel, lazy daisy, blanket stitch, back stitch, and more. She could do anything. Her world became embroidery. It didn't matter that she never showed any interest in the other lessons her mother tried to teach her. She had discovered the most important thing. She was able to continue the Wayne family tradition. Then my little sister arrived. When Margaret was born, I was 11, Olivia was 12, and Jacob was 14. My mother's world abruptly changed, and the baby became her only concern. It didn't bother me too much. Jacob didn't either. She ignored us, and we were used to it. However, Olivia. I recalled the expression on her face as Mother repeatedly brushed her off. I observed Olivia as she watched Mother swoon over the infant, the stiffness around her mouth and the chilly shock in her eyes. Her thoughts were shouting, "Not good enough, not good enough, not good enough anymore." And I could just hear them. I had no idea how to cheer her up. Over time, the gap between us had only widened. Despite being my biological sister, she didn't feel like a sister. Rather, she was a stranger sharing a home. Reaching out to her and asking how she was doing felt too weird and awkward. Thus, I didn't. I chose the coward's route. I acted as though nothing had altered. However, it had. It was soon hard to ignore those changes. Olivia lost herself in her embroidery while Mother became even more aloof, as though creating the ideal artwork will win her mother's approval. She had so many crafts in her room, including clothes, blankets, and pillows. Her artwork became increasingly complex and intricate. She transformed from an expert to a true genius, and even I was able to recognize her true talent through my anger and contempt. Mom didn't even notice. When I visited Olivia's room one day to inform her that dinner was ready, I saw her well-planned projects in utter chaos. She had started stitching her own patterns into her bedspread and the fabric bodies of her rag dolls. She was embroidering it if she could get a needle into it. "What are you doing?" I inquired. She didn't respond. She had never been a talkative person, but she stopped talking much when Mother left. Olivia had gotten sick by the time Margaret was a year old. Even now, Mother barely noticed her. I believed that Olivia would eventually acknowledge that she had lost favor. Every usable surface in her room was sewn into oblivion, leaving it a mass of thread. Not a single piece of fabric remained for her to utilize. I didn't notice her arms until she had ran out of space. One morning, her gaze was lifeless and listless as she sat on the porch. She might have considered covering the marks if she had realized I was coming. "What is that, Olivia?" I gasped upon seeing her arm. "What did you do?" Her clothing was soiled by blood dripping from a tangle of pinpricks on her right forearm. Faintly, she scratched at the marks, her fingertips peeling away red. Without glancing at me, she whispered, "I've been practicing." I said, "You did that to yourself." As if it were the most natural thing in the world, she insisted, I needed to practice. I then had a mental image of Olivia repeatedly sewing a satin stitch while the blood trickled down her arm by threading a needle into her skin. She got up and retreated inside before I could come up with anything further to say. Father asked me whether I had observed anything odd about Olivia that evening. I was shocked that it had taken him this long to realize something was wrong, even though he was rarely home and was usually on the road for work. I shook my head, unable to meet his gaze. I said nothing at all. When Margaret vanished, she was 18 months old. One morning when Mother woke up, she had disappeared from her cradle. Screaming her name, she ripped the house up in search of the infant. Even Olivia, who had recovered enough from her daze to recognize that something horrible must have occurred, offered assistance. The cops showed up within an hour to conduct a search and ask questions. They decided to look for Father first, since, according to the officer, a man should be aware that his own child is gone. The clerk said. Probably to give us something to do, he instructed us all to check the house one last time. After all, we would have heard her sobbing if she had remained in the house. That afternoon, Father returned home under police protection. After questioning him, they questioned every one of our neighbors. They looked for footsteps in the yard. In order to search the woods behind the home, they organized a search party. The kids were told to go to our rooms. In the living room, I could hear Mother crying as Father consoled her. For hours, I sat awake on my bed. I had no doubt that the cops would soon visit the residence. They would assure us that everything was fine and that they had located Margaret. They were forced to. But my patience grew weaker as the night went on. My eyes started to sag. My thoughts started to stray. Before long, I was sound asleep. The following morning, as dawn was just beginning to peek over the horizon, I got up early. As I opened my bedroom door, there was silence throughout the house. In order to decide whether or not to leave my bedroom and face the day, I argued with myself for a few moments. I concluded that the idea of spending any more time in my room was too much for me to bear. Fearful of disturbing the quiet of the morning, I slipped out into the corridor. On my way up the stairs, I passed Olivia's door and heard her low-pitched voice humming a song that I knew well, a lullaby that our mother had sang to us when we were kids. I twisted the doorknob curiously. "Olivia?" To see if she would join me downstairs to wait for the rest of the family to get up, I pushed the door open and yelled in the loudest whisper I dared. For the first time in more than a year, she looked up at me and grinned. "Hello," she said to Sybil. Her nightgown and face were both smeared with blood. She had so much of it that it seemed to cover the whole bed. Her needlework equipment, which included scissors, thread, and a needle, was sitting next to her. In her arms she held something. She said, "Come and see," utterly unaware of my growing panic as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. I sneaked up on her and looked into her arms. At first, I was unable to understand what I was witnessing since it was so bloody. Then, when I recognized my sister's flawless, small embroidered stitches, horror started to set in. Inserted directly into a person's skin, satin stitches, drawn taut through the flesh, encased the small body. Both the eyes and the lips had been sewed shut. "Andrea, isn't she gorgeous?" Olivia crooned. I reasoned that it couldn't be what I believed it to be. "What have you done, Olivia?" She gave me a tiny giggle and shook her head, as if I had said something funny. "It's a present, for Mom," she asked, looking up at me through her thick lashes. "Do you think she'll like it?" All I could see, though, was baby Margaret, or what remained of her anyway. This is roughly how the rest of the narrative unfolds. Previous day, early in the morning, Olivia had removed Margaret from her cradle. In her room, she had placed her on the bed and covered her with a pillow. She then removed her baby doll from its tiny carriage and put Margaret inside. No one noticed the difference because Olivia had decided to search her own room. That evening, while Jacob and I were falling asleep in our bedrooms and our parents were sobbing in the living room, Olivia took out her thread and stitch and transformed little Margaret into something completely different. Her last work of art. When my shouts woke up the whole house the following morning, my parents realized what she had done. I wish I had the foresight to wake up and inform my father of Olivia's actions, to prevent Mother and Jacob from witnessing it firsthand. However, I didn't. Additionally, they had the most severe shock of their lives. My mom never bounced back from that. She screamed like a ferocious animal while hysterically holding Margaret's body to her chest. When the police came to take Olivia away, she was sedated and sent to the hospital. Her heart failed a few days later, therefore she didn't survive another week. My mom passed away from heartbreak. After losing Mother, Margaret, and Olivia, Father couldn't stand to see us kids. We had scarcely spoken to our grandparents, who treated Jacob and me like intruders breaking into their house, so he sent us away to live with them. I don't know when my father passed away, but it was probably 3 or 4 years after the murder. Jacob and I were kept in the dark about what transpired. I guess he drank himself to death, knowing my father. When Jacob reached the appropriate age, he enlisted in the military. He assured me that he would return, and that, as the only 2 members of our sad little family remaining, we would remain together. 2 months after his departure, he passed away abroad. After reading and appreciating No Sleep for some time, I thought it was time to relate my personal experiences. Since English is my second language and I'm not very good at writing, I apologize if there are any errors. I will tell you about a night that was the scariest thing I have ever experienced. After that, some more intriguing things happened, but if you guys are interested, I will post about them later. Let's start by providing some background details. In the same room as my father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, I was born at my father's farm. Around 1870, the property where I was born was constructed. It was constructed on the site of an earlier farm that was destroyed by fire. My great-great-grandfather built the new farm, and it has been in the family ever since. I'm grateful that I was raised on this farm, since it's a great place to grow up with lots of room for play. I spent half a week at my dad's farm and half a week at my mom's house after my parents divorced when I was 2 years old. I began to notice things at my dad's house when I was about 12 years old. At first, there was only a sense of presence. I was afraid that someone would be standing next to my bed, so I always slept with my back to the wall. Every time I worked up the nerve to look, I saw nothing. I always had this feeling at my dad's place, but I never felt anything at my mom's. I had strange experiences and constantly sensing this presence, especially upstairs. One time I lost my shoes and discovered them under a pile of stuff in my room. It wasn't a prank, because they had only been out of my sight for 5 minutes at most. and I was having breakfast with everyone at the house, and I was tapped on the shoulder when no one else was around. I also had empty glasses of water refilled while I was home alone. Then I found myself at home by myself one evening. I was seated in our downstairs office, which was adjacent to the living room. I could see into the living room since the large sliding doors were open. The phone abruptly rang while I was on the internet, speaking with a friend on MSN. When I saw it displayed, I got up and went to it. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. It's the one that usually stated private number if it had been a private number. Nothing was on the other end of the line when I picked it up. I didn't give it much attention, but something that happened on my way back to the office really freaked me out. Abruptly, the living room radio came on. I was astonished, but I convinced myself that I had been listening to my own music in the office and hadn't heard the radio. I took a seat again and told my friend about the radio and phone. We chuckled over it. After that, my dog began to bark in the kitchen. My dog is usually silent until something important is going on. When I went to the kitchen to look into it, I noticed that my dog was acting apprehensively. I gazed through the window as I tell him to accompany me. From there, you can see the front door and parking space, but there aren't any cars there. I can also make out a black shadow approaching my front door. I'm starting to get anxious now. I return to my computer with my dog. She is still apprehensive when I move around, but she seems a little more secure in my presence. Naturally, when I tell my friend what I observed, she suggests that I give her a call. I agreed, but I told her I would retrieve my cell phone instead of using the eerie 0000000 phone to contact her. It was upstairs in my room, which was a little issue. I chose to sing a tune as I made my way upstairs, in an attempt to relax. I was told that if you appear at ease, ghosts won't do anything. Fortunately, there was a switch to turn on the light at the top of the stairs before you had to go up. So I went up and turned right to my room as soon as I got there. Due to the hallway's utter darkness, eerie appearance, and sense of unease, I didn't even glance to my left. I entered my room after the door had been slightly opened, quickly turned on the light once more, and noticed my phone resting on my desk. I approached my phone without averting my gaze. I could feel my heart pounding, and the same sense of being watched was stronger than before. When I picked up my phone, all of a sudden, bam! There was a loud bang from the eerie corridor. It appeared as though someone had slammed his flat hand into a cupboard in the hallway in an attempt to shatter it. I never went down those stairs so quickly in my life, and I'm not sure how fast I got back in my office. There was nothing in the corridor, and my friend contacted me as soon as I got to my office. I was freaking out when I picked it up. I had never felt more exposed than when my dog was barking. As previously mentioned, this house was 150 years old, and since I grew up there, I was familiar with every crevice and noise. I swear to God, it sounded like 10 people rushing around upstairs like animals, and I could tell who was walking upstairs just by the sounds they made. I simply turned up my music as loudly as I could and continued to chat with my companion, informing her that I could hear footsteps upstairs. When people heard that shit was going on, they started talking to me, and I just sat in my office, thinking I was going to die or something. Before I realize it, my dog stops barking, and the sensation gradually goes away. I heard the automobile when my folks arrived home. They came into the living room before I left the office. I've never been more terrified in my life, and after that night, I realized that everything that had happened, even the small things, and the presence I felt, was not human. After that night, I lay in bed with my back to the wall, but I never glanced because I knew that something was watching me.